Mr. Speaker, this morning, Sir Martin Morbick published the final report of the Grenfell Tower Inquiry. And I'm sure the whole House will join me in thanking him, the members of the inquiry and the whole team for their dedicated work. Mr. Speaker, I want to speak directly to the bereaved families, the survivors and those in the immediate Grenfell community, some of whom are with us in the gallery today. Sir Martin concluded this morning, and I'm afraid there's no way of repeating this that won't be painful. He said the simple truth is that the deaths that occurred were all avoidable, and that those who lived in the tower were badly failed over a number of years and in a number of different ways by, as the report lays out in full, just about every institution responsible for ensuring their safety. Mr. Speaker, in the face of an injustice so painful, so deserving of anger, words can begin to lose their meaning. 7 years still waiting for the justice that you deserve. I want to say very clearly on behalf of the country, you've been let down so badly, before, during and in the aftermath of this tragedy. And while Sir Martin sets out a catalogue of appalling industry failures, for which there must now be full accountability, he also finds, and I quote, decades of failure by central government. He concludes that in the years between the fire at Knowsley Heights in 1991 and the fire at Grenfell Tower in 2017, there were many opportunities for the government to identify the risks posed by the use of combustible cladding panels and insulation. And he concludes, and I quote, by 2016, the department was well aware of those risks, but failed to act on what they knew. He further finds that the department itself was poorly run, and the government's deregulatory agenda dominated the department's thinking to such an extent that even matters affecting the safety of life were ignored, delayed, or disregarded. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to start with an apology on behalf of the British state to each and every one of you, and indeed to all of the families affected by this tragedy. It should never have happened. The country failed to discharge its most fundamental duty, to protect you and your loved ones, the people that we are here to serve, and I am deeply sorry. I also want to express my admiration for the strength it must have taken to relive these events when giving your evidence to the inquiry, and indeed to see written down today the circumstances that led to the death of your loved ones. After all you've been through, you may feel you're always one step away from another betrayal. I get that, and I know I cannot change that with just words today. But what I can say is I listened carefully to one of the members of the inquiry, Ali Akbar, this morning, who said this: what is needed is for those with responsibility for building safety to reflect and to treat Grenfell as a touchstone in all that they do in the future. Mr. Speaker, I consider myself someone responsible for building safety, and that is exactly what I will do and what I'll demand of this government. Mr. Speaker, today is a long-awaited day of truth, but it must now lead to a day of justice. Yes. Justice for the victims and the families of Grenfell, but also a moment to reflect on the state of social justice in our country, and a chance for this government of service to turn the page. Because this tragedy poses fundamental questions about the kind of country we are, a country where the voices of working class people and those of colour have been repeatedly ignored and dismissed. A country where tenants of a social housing block in one of the richest parts of the land are treated like second-class citizens, shamefully dismissed. In the words of one survivor, as people with needs and problems not respected as citizens, as people who contribute to Britain, who are part of Britain, who belong in Britain. And Mr. Speaker, unbelievably, this continued even after the tragedy. Sir Martin highlights, and I quote, "Certain aspects of the response demonstrated a marked lack of respect for human decency and dignity, and left many of those immediately affected feeling abandoned by authority and utterly helpless." Mr. Speaker, that alone should make anyone who feels any affinity towards justice bristle with anger. But Sir Martin continues. He finds, and these are his words, Mr. Speaker, systematic dishonesty on the part of those who made and sold the rain screen cladding panels and insulation products. And he goes on to say, they engaged in deliberate and sustained strategies to manipulate the testing process, misrepresent test data, and mislead the market. Sir Martin also cites a complete failure on the part of the local authority building control over a number of years to take basic steps to ensure that the certificates it issued were technically accurate. He finds that the work of the building research establishment was marred by unprofessional conduct, inadequate practices, a lack of effective oversight, poor reporting, and a lack of scientific rigour, and that the tenant management organisation must bear a share of the blame. Its only fire safety assessor, these are his words, had misrepresented his experience and qualifications, some of which he invented, and was ill-informed to carry out fire risk assessments on buildings of the size and complexity of Grenfell Tower. He also finds a chronic lack of effective management and leadership on behalf of the London Fire Brigade, with tragic consequences on the night of the fire. Mr. Speaker, in the light of such findings, it is imperative that there is full accountability, including through the criminal justice process, and that this happens as swiftly as possible. So I can tell the House today that this government will write to all companies found by the inquiry to be part of these horrific failings as the first step to stopping them being awarded government contracts. And we will, of course, support the Metropolitan Police and the prosecutors as they complete their investigations. But, Mr. Speaker, it is vital that as we respond to this report today, we do not do or say anything that could compromise any future prosecution, because the greatest injustice of all would be for the victims and all those affected not to get the justice that they deserve. Mr. Speaker, there must also be more radical action to stop something like this from ever happening again, because one of the most extraordinary qualities of the Grenfell community is their determination to look forward. They are not only fighting for justice for themselves, they are fighting to ensure that no other community suffers as they have done. Mr. Speaker, some important reforms have taken place in the last 7 years, reforms that we supported in opposition, including banning combustible cladding, new oversight of building control, a new safety regime for all residential buildings over 18 metres, new legal requirements on social landlords, making sure fire and rescue services are trained and equipped to handle large-scale incidents, including moving from stay put to get out when needed. And we're now addressing the recommendation from Sir Martin's first report to introduce a new residential personal emergency evacuation plan policy for anyone whose ability to evacuate could be compromised, and funding from this from renting in social housing. Mr. Speaker, we will look at all 58 of Sir Martin's recommendations in detail. There will be a debate on the floor of this House. We will respond in full to the inquirer's recommendations within 6 months, and we will update Parliament annually on our progress against every commitment that we make. But there are some things I can say right now. There are still buildings today with unsafe cladding, and the speed at which this is being addressed is far, far too slow. We only have to look at the fire in Dagenham last week a building that was still in the process of having its cladding removed. So this must be a moment of change. We'll take the necessary steps to speed this up. We will be willing to force freeholders to assess their buildings and enter remediation schemes within set timetables, with a legal requirement to force action if that is what it takes. And we will set out further steps on remediation this autumn. We will also reform the construction products industry that make this fatal cladding so homes are made of safe materials. And those who compromise that safety will face the consequences. We will ensure that tenants and their leaseholders can never again be ignored, and that social landlords are held to account for the decency and safety of their homes. And as this government tackles the most acute housing crisis in living memory, building 1.5 million new homes across the country, we will ensure those homes are safe, secure, and built to the highest standards. Places of security, health and well-being that serve the needs of residents and their wider communities. Because a safe and decent home is a human right and a basic expectation, and the provision of that right should never be undermined by the reckless pursuit of greed. One of the tragedies of Grenfell is that this is a community that nurtured so much of what we want from housing. People who had made the tower their home and were entitled to a place of safety and security, not a death trap. And yet, time and again, they were ignored. Mr. Speaker, 2 weeks ago, I made a private visit to Grenfell Tower and laid a wreath at the memorial wall, and affirmed this government's commitment to the work of the Memorial Commission, delivering a permanent memorial on the site through a process led by the Grenfell community. As I walked down that narrow staircase from the 23rd floor and looked at walls burned by 1,000-degree heat, I got just a sense of how utterly, utterly terrifying it must have been. And as I saw examples of the cladding on the outside of the building and listened to descriptions of the catastrophic and completely avoidable failures of that fatal refurbishment, I felt just a sense of the anger that now rises through that building. And it left me, Mr. Speaker, with a profound and very personal determination to make the legacy of Grenfell Tower one of the defining changes to our country that I want to make as Prime Minister. To the families, the survivors and the immediate community, we will support you now and always, especially those that were children. In the memory of your loved ones, we will deliver a generational shift in the safety and quality of housing for everyone in this country. And in the memory of Grenfell, we will change our country, not just a change in policy and regulation, although that must of course take place, but a profound shift in culture and behaviour. A rebalancing of power that gives voice and respect to every citizen, whoever they are and wherever they live. And Mr. Speaker, we will bring the full power of government to bear on this task, because that is the responsibility of service and the duty we owe to the memory of every one of the 72. And in that spirit, I commend this statement to the House.